Hello again and welcome to the final video of Shaping Light. My name is Ian. In this video I'm going to be walking you through the final stage of creating your lantern, which we call skinning. So if you have followed along to this point, you should have a frame on a mount with a light inside. For this stage you can remove your light and just work with your frame. For this process, you're going to need the following materials. You're going to need a bed sheet, just a basic cotton bed sheet. It is important that you use cotton and not synthetics. You're going to need a piece of chalk or a pencil, as well as a pair of scissors that is sharp enough to cut fabric, but that you don't necessarily care about all that much. And lastly, you're going to need maybe 400 milliliters of carpenter's glue. The reason we use carpenter's glue is that it is slightly more water resistant than white glue, but by all means, if you have white glue, you can use that. It'll work pretty much the same. So let's get right into it. So skinning is perhaps one of the more challenging parts of this process. It's also the most satisfying because it is when you finally get to see the shape of your lantern take place. What you're going to be doing is you're going to be finding the shapes that have been created in your frame, so these negative spaces that are between these rods of osier, and you're going to be cutting pieces of fabric that fit those pieces. So the way I like to approach this is take a small piece of your bed sheet or an edge of your bed sheet. And again, this doesn't need to be a bed sheet per se. The reason I say a bed sheet is that you can often get them for free if they're used. But if you have any cotton that is available to you, you're welcome to use that. So I have an edge of the cotton bed sheet. I'm just going to lay it down on that space that I'm looking to cover. So just to reiterate, it is a negative space between these rods of osier. So I'm covering that space, and I'm making sure that there's enough of an overlap on the edge of the osier here. And there should be at least an inch, if not an inch and a half of overlap from the edge of the osier. Then with my chalk, I'm simply tracing that shape with the chalk. You can use pencil. The reason I use chalk is that it goes on easily and it comes off easily. I would stay away from permanent marker or pen because you are going to see those marks on your finished product, and you might not like that result. So chalk is an excellent tool because you can just wipe it away. So now we've got that shape traced out, and I'm going to put my lantern aside, keeping in mind what area I just had selected. Whether you want to mark that or not is up to you. And I'm left with this shape on the bed sheet. So now I'm taking my scissors and I'm cutting about an inch and a half outside of that shape. And the reason that we're cutting an inch and a half instead of along that edge is that we are looking to have a little bit of excess material so that we're not falling short. Because you're working with odd shapes, you're likely to make a mistake or be inaccurate at some point in your marking. So this extra inch and a half just gives you a bit of wiggle room on your shape. the very worst case is to go through the effort of cutting out your shape and find out that it's too small. So now I have a rough outline of a shape. I'm going to see if that lines up on my lantern. And it does. I should have lots of excess, but not an excessive amount. And now I'm going to put that aside and I'm going to grab my glue. So you can apply the glue in a number of ways. You are more than welcome to simply drip the glue straight onto the frame. I do find that if you don't have a consistent bead, it will drip off, and if you have fabric on the other side, you might have a couple drips that land on that, and that will show up on your lantern. You can use just a simple palette and put glue. I'm just using a piece of cardboard for a palette, and you can put just a little puddle of glue there. And if you've got a little extra piece of osier kicking around from when you made the frame, that often serves as a nice applicator. So you're just dabbling that on to the frame here. You can also do a combo method where you drip the glue straight on and then spread it out with your stick so that it's not dripping excessively. You'll notice that on this space that I'm creating, I've got a couple of tricky parts where maybe there's too much wire or there's a ridge from the osier. You might want to add a little bit of extra glue to those parts because the fabric needs to stick to the frame first, and then it will stick to the next layer of fabric. So a little extra glue doesn't hurt. So now that this entire ridge is covered with glue, I can pick up my shape, my fabric shape, and I'm going to start at one edge and line up that chalk shape with the shape of the ridge and gradually lay it down so that I'm covering that space. Sometimes I might need to stretch it or thin it out or spread it out with my hands. What I don't want to do is drag it across that glue and have all that glue just smudge across the fabric there. And you'll see that I'm going along that whole ridge with my fingers and just making sure that that glue is nice and in contact with the fabric. And this is our first shape. So we will be coming back to trim these edges, but before we trim those edges, we want to let this glue dry for maybe about 10-15 minutes, just enough so that the glue becomes tacky and that you're not disrupting that shape you just put on there. So what I usually do to continue working and create a work flow on this lantern is I will flip the lantern over and find a new shape. Maybe one that is not sharing the same ridge as the previous one. And do the exact same process again. So taking the cotton and line it out, spreading it out, making my chalk line on that shape, making sure that the fabric isn't wrinkled when I make that shape, because that's one way you lose accuracy. And then cutting out that shape, applying with glue. And I can do this 2 or 3 times finding new shapes until I've done enough that the ones I was working on 2 or 3 shapes ago are now tacky enough to start trimming. So now I've put on 2 more shapes and I'm ready to go back to the first shape I put on and trim those edges. For this part of the process, you're going to want to make sure that you're working with sharp scissors. So I've actually switched my scissors here. My first pair of scissors was not very good and I've gone back to a very well-loved pair of lantern scissors. As you can see, the glue has built up over time, but they're still very good scissors. If I'm working with dull scissors, this part of the process is going to get really messy and you're going to be pretty upset with the results. But if your scissors are sharp, the aim is to have a nice clean edge along that ridge. So I've got these ridges. The glue is now a little tackier, although it's pretty cold in this barn, so it's drying a little slower than usual, but I'll just go ahead and do it. So I'm trying to cut right along that ridge in a nice clean line so that there's enough fabric hitting that surface. If you've split your osier, you've got that nice flat edge. And if you haven't split your osier, you're just trying to hit as much of that rounded edge as possible. And then trimming a nice clean line along the rest of the edge. So now that I've cut that edge, you'll notice that this shape has opened up now because I can put fabric now on top of this. The tricky thing about that is you're now going to be cutting fabric alongside other fabric, which I'll demonstrate in a little bit. But before I do that, I'm going to finish cutting out all the edges along this shape. Your scissors will get gunky. It's good to just keep wiping them, as is shown by my scissors, which have been used for a couple of lanterns now. They're still working great, so good for them. So I'm now at the point where I'm covering a shape that is surrounded by other covered shapes. So I'm gluing fabric onto fabric. Just lay it on there as we've been doing. And as I mentioned previously, trimming this is a little more tricky because you have fabric underneath it. So you really want to be aware that you're not cutting fabric you've already laid down, and also that you're getting the cleanest possible line because this is your finishing line. It's going to be very visible. You might think, oh, I can just glue further in and get more of a surface area. I would stay away from that. You want these lines that the frame has made to stay the nice, clean, organic lines that the osier is. If you're pulling the fabric beyond the osier, those lines get muddied when the light shines through it. What is beautiful about these lanterns is that the internal structure is illuminated when there's a light inside of it. So if you are moving away from that internal structure, you're sort of compromising that design. So here we are with a final trim of fabric on fabric. You can see that I'm pulling the fabric on top to make sure that it's nice and tight, while making sure that I'm not catching the fabric underneath, and trying my best to follow that ridge without fraying the fabric too much. Again, this doesn't need to be perfect. The light is going to be beautiful no matter what. This is a tricky part of the process that we're all bound to mess up. But this is, in general, the edge you're aspiring to. So I would continue this process, filling in all the spaces. Before I cover the whole thing, I just need to be sure of a couple of little details. Let's not forget that we still have our light that needs to come inside of this frame, which means that we need some point in this lantern in which we can get this mason jar up inside and hook it to the inside of that lantern. So what I'm doing is I'm going to pick one space that I'm going to leave empty. For me, I think it's going to be this back space, because that's just probably the size of a mason jar in a hand that I can get that in well enough. So I'm going to cover everything except for that space. And that's very important. There's nothing more heartbreaking than finishing a lantern and then realizing that you've forgotten about the light. And that goes the same for the battery packs. You've strategically placed your trigger, so you are going to leave just a little hole big enough to get a finger up in there so that you can hit that switch. Once you've covered your whole lantern and you've trimmed it and it's dry, you're ready for the final stage. I won't do it here, but the final stage is a finishing glue that makes the entire skin firm. So you might see a little bit in this lantern that the skin is quite solid. It doesn't actually feel like fabric all that much. That's because I've coated it with a mixture of glue and water. So this is 50% glue and 50% water mixed well. And with a paintbrush, I've applied 2 layers of it nice and evenly across the whole skin. And what that does is, one, it makes it firm, so it makes the structure more secure. But more importantly, it fills in all of the holes or the little gaps in the threads so that the light is captured more evenly. As well, it makes the skin taut. So if there's any sort of wrinkle in your skin when you've been skinning the fabric, this glue finish makes it nice and a nice clean finish. And you can often cover up some wrinkly bits or parts that are sagging with this firming glue. So one important thing to keep in mind is that don't apply the finishing glue until the glue on your skin is completely dry. Otherwise, when you're painting your lantern with this glue, all of the edges that you've meticulously spent all this time pasting and cutting will come off. So that's an important thing. Remember to let the lantern dry completely. There's a couple of other things that you can do that are sort of bonus if you are wanting to extend your lantern skills. If you're looking at making a lantern waterproof, there's a couple of techniques you can do. The first and most simple method is that in your glue mixture. You're going to add in a bit of acrylic glaze, clear acrylic glaze, and that will just make the whole lantern a bit more waterproof. The other thing you can do is, if you are really interested in making it waterproof, you could hand stitch all of these seams. That takes a long time, but it is worth it if you know that you have a parade in the rain and you want these lanterns that you've worked so hard on to last the whole parade. I leave it up to you. This one layer of glue that dries, the glue finish is going to be very durable, very beautiful, and as you can see, it doesn't take an incredible amount of time, but does take some patience and dedication. Thank you so much for joining me for this online workshop in lantern building. I hope you were able to gather something out of these videos. I would love to let you know about the River Clyde Winter Parade, which is happening on December 21st, 2020. We invite anyone who built a lantern through these workshops to take it on a walk wherever they are. And together we might collectively share a bit of light on the darkest day of the year, the winter solstice. My name is Ian. To find out more about the Winter Parade, you can visit riverclydepageant.com.